We used to fly from Lae up to Bulalo, was where the Bulalo Gold Dredging had their headquarters. Initially we went in there DH-84s and then DC-3s. As a matter of fact, the Qantas establishment down at Lae was built out of timber that was milled at Bulalo, and we used to fly it down in DC-3s. The DC-3 would be laden with timber. There was just enough room to get in and out of the cockpit for the pilots. Did many trips in and out of Bulalo, for the Bulalo Gold Dredging. There's one particular trip I did in a DH-84. Bertie, I've forgotten his surname now, but he was the manager down at Lae, and we used to pick up bags of gold in Bulalo and bring them down to Lae. And I had 12 bags of gold on there one day. Got down to Lae, and Bert met me down there, and he said, how many bags of gold have you got? For a joke, I said, 13. And he said, there's only 12. I said, a lot of turbulence on the way down, we must have lost one. All hell broke loose for a while. I confess what had happened. He was a very, very relieved man, of course. But these are some of the construction that we made out of the timber that was brought down from Bulalo. Bert was one of the chaps that was with Kingsford Smith when they had that Coffee Royal incident over in Western Australia.
Yes, yeah.
He swears it was fair dinkum, but there's always two schools of thought about that. Well, this is the Bristol freighter that was brought out by Qantas to trial in New Guinea. It was brought out by the Bristol Airplane Company with their pilots to operate in and out of Wau. And it would have been highly successful, only one of the flights up there, the English captain, had not been briefed to always park the airplane sideways at Wau, which is a grade of 1 in 10. And he parked it sideways, and the lead knob on the end of the Bowden cable broke, and the aeroplane went backwards down the whole of Wau Strip and smashed itself down the bottom. So that was the end of the Bristol freighter, which would have been an excellent airplane apart from that. A few pictures of the wreck here. That's the Bristol freighter and some of the crew having a look at it. Dick Mant, that's a picture of him coming out of the front of the Bristol freighter. Dick Mant checked me out on the flight from Port Moresby across to Lae when I took up the first DH-84 for Qantas that was based in Lae. On behalf of the administration, Colonel Murray asked for the Qantas to base an airplane there to fly some of his administration officials around the airport, and that's Dick Mant, who flew me across the range there, told me the way to go to Lae. And these are photographs of some of the unfortunate accidents of Qantas aeroplanes with new pilots that came up. This chap was on his way from Lae to Bulalo and couldn't get through the Snake Gap and crashed into the trees there, and he and two passengers were on the ground. They fell out of it, and the cargo, which was mainly cans of vegetables, was dropping down like shrapnel all around them. But unfortunately they all survived with no major breakages. Frank Furness, Kainantu Gold Dredging is now on the stock exchange listing. They were getting a lot of gold up there by individual miners, but Frank went in there one day in a DH-84 and the ground was very wet. Slid along the runway and smashed the aeroplane. It took about 6 or 7 months to rebuild it. And that particular aeroplane is now down in just out of Geelong. A chap down there is flying it quite successfully. Throughout the history of New Guinea there are numerous prangs. This is another one. Another pilot that crashed into the side of Mount Karagomna. We said goodbye to him up there. Let's see now, these are different little aeroplanes going into short strips. This is Boana, just out of Lae, where one of our DH-83s is taking off and crashed into the ground there. This is Avro Anson, which crashed up at Karachi. a new pilot and from another airline, who's just been recruited, and he finished up smashing the Arrow Anson there. We never persevered with that type of aeroplane. And this is a picture of when we were freighting natives across from the Seapick River across to New Britain to work on the coconut plantations. We used to line them up in these bucket seats all the way along, and they were very thin and underfed when we took them over there, but after they did a year's work over in the plantations, they converted all the money they were paid into goods and chattels and took them all back to the Seapick, where they were more or less greeted as gods when they went back with all their fortunes. Various pictures of the operation around New Guinea.
That photo just back a page, Len, with the, is it DC3 there, is it? Is that one of the Qantas DC? Just back another page it might have been. Yeah, that one there.
Qantas DC3 over at Rabaul with Matapi, the active volcano in the background there.
Okay, yeah.
This is where I had an unfortunate accident, Tarpini. It's on the little strip on the side of Mount Yule. Managed to survive, of course, a bit of a bandage. The local patrol officer sewed up my eye, which I thought I'd lost, but hadn't. He was very successful with that.
So tell us the story about that again, Len, with the...
Well, I was flying DC-3s up there in New Guinea, and Orm Denny, who was the manager of Qantas in New Guinea at the time, called me up on the strip and lay and said, "Look, Len, we want you to go across to Port Moresby. The administrator wants native policemen to be flown into Tarpini." And I said, "Well, Orm, I've just been flying DC-3. It's a bit ambitious for me flying a DH-83. He said, "Oh, never mind, you'll be right." So I took the DH-83 across to Port Moresby, put 3 police boys in the internal accommodation for them with all their gear, flew up to Tarpini, but unfortunately struck a katabatic wind on the approach. The grade there is 1 in 7, and struck a downdraft and wiped the undercarriage off. The aeroplane slid quite successfully down the slope into a creek. The police boys hopped out, thanked me, "Thank you very much, Toby." Away they went. They thought it was all part of the show. I'm sitting there with blood coming out of my head, and I thought I'd lost my eye, but didn't know much about eyes, so I put my hand up, and fortunately it went back into wherever it was. I lifted up the flap over the eye, and the patrol officer came down. He said, "Look, we'll go up to the patrol hut and I'll sew that up. It's got to be sewn up." So we went up there, and I said, "What are you going to do it with?" He said, "Oh, I've got a needle and cotton here, twine." So he bent the needle in a blow lamp, and he said, "Here, you better drink this." And he gave me a glass of what we call the Black Beach rum negrita. He said, "Use that as anaesthetic." After the first stitch, I said, "Oh, Christ." And he crossed himself. He must have been very religious. And I said, "You better give me some more anaesthetic." So I filled the glass up again, put the second stitch in, and to this day, all I've got on my eye is a very faint scar. It was very successful indeed. So that just goes to show you necessity is the mother of invention. Play that one.
Very good.
Various pictures of the praying up in Tarpini, bent prop. That's the strip there, which is the grade is 1 in 7.
Okay, what sort of aircraft was that? That was the
DH-83, a Fox Moth, yeah.
Yep.
The Fox Moth won the King's Cup in 1980, I think it was 1950, or it might have been 43 or 53 over in Great Britain.
Okay, yeah.
And that's a picture of UZD, which is the aeroplane that I first flew to Charleville with the Royal Flying Doctor Service, and had it out there quite successfully for a couple of years, and eventually it finished up in New Guinea.
Okay.
And that's the transported the aeroplane down to Port Moresby. Whether it was rebuilt or not, I don't know. Couldn't help you there. Bunch of Japanese prisoners over at Rabaul just after the war. There was a hill over there that the Japanese had converted into a hospital. They were great tunnellers, the Japs. But when the Yanks went over there and took the place, they closed the entrance to the tunnel in and left the Japs in there. They didn't bother to take them out. So that's just a picture of some of the ones that were there.
Yep.
Weren't, and that's a picture of Mattaby exploding upside down, of course.
These are all just various photos from...
Just various little photographs taken around New Guinea and the tributaries there. We used to come back along the Markham Valley after we'd done a freight run up into the highlands. We were all equipped with a good pair of bleacher boots and a Smith & Wesson 45 in case we ever come down. The natives up there, cuckoos, had no compunction about eating you see, so we always carried a Smith & Wesson. But coming back from the highlands, coming down the Markham Valley there, if you come down very low, you can see the crocs on the side of the stream. You just take a few pot shots at them with the old Smith & Wesson just to make sure we had our eyes in. I don't think the crocs appreciated it much, but it was quite good practice. Well, that's about it, I think. Greg, unless there's anything more that you wish to cover. The natives up there are very, very primitive, and we took a DH-84 in there, and the patrol officer in the centre there, I've forgotten his name now, but he was very appreciative of the fact that we could fly the aeroplane in there, and the natives up there knew absolutely nothing about aeroplanes. So we got the chief one day, put him in the aeroplane, took him up and did a few low runs over his constituents or his tribe, and he thought that was great when he saw them all scatter, you see. So we used to fly in up there regularly after that, opened up Tarpeeni, and an Australian author, Frank Clune, he went up there once with us with his wife, and he had a good look around. I think he gave it a mention in one of his books, Prowling Through Papua or something like that. He wrote a book about it.
Okay.
Very interesting indeed.
So where were you born, Len?
I was born in Bickers, New South Wales, 1922.
Yeah.
Exactly 100 years after Ulysses S. Grant was born in 1822 in America. And that is a clue that I give some of these government departments when they want identification. Ulysses S. Grant, 1822, me, 1922. Yeah. I come back to Sydney, back to Mooloolaba. I was on a banana plantation, dairy farm with my father for quite some time. Went through Mooloolaba High School, then Kempsey High School. Got a job with the Lands Department in Sydney. War broke out, of course, and at this time I was in the militia. And we were dive bombed by the Royal Australian Air Force one day in Hawker Demons, and I was laying in the ground covered in mud after our exercise, and I said to the sergeant, I said, what happens to those fellas when they finish this exercise? They said, oh, they go back to the mess and have a few beers, and I said, that is for me. So I put in an application to join the Air Force, and the Army weren't letting them go in these days, but I thought I've got to do something about this, so I got myself a job in battalion headquarters. I was fairly proficient with the typewriter. And the CO was one of these chaps who loved his golf. I used to prepare all the papers, put them for him to sign. So I slipped a paper in which gave me permission to leave the Army and join the Air Force. So I joined the Air Force. Spent a little time with them. Couldn't get into action because they were doing fairly well with the fight at that time. So after a while, Qantas called for volunteers to come from the Air Force into Qantas. So I put my name down, lo and behold, Qantas said, righto, we've got you, we'll take up to Brisbane. So I was based in Brisbane, flying DH-86s for a while, then DC-3s, eventually went out to Charleville with the Royal Flying Doctor Service, DH-83s, DH-84s, after 3 years there, they said, all right, we want to send an aeroplane up to New Guinea to be based up there to do work for the administration. So there was a senior bloke to me, but he pulled out, so I got the job, went up to New Guinea, was up there for 4 years on DH-84s, DC-3s. I thought, well, you've got to progress in this game, so I gave New Guinea away, went down to Sydney, and they put me on DC-4s, up and down to Japan, Singapore, quite a bit. Eventually, after the DC-4s became, at the same time, Qantas had Lockheed 749s, and I was looking at these things, and then they got the 1049s, so I graduated to the 1049 as a first officer for some time, became a captain on the 1049s, joined the flight training section, was checking pilots in and out for licence renewals, proficiency checks, what have you, and thereafter that, Qantas then got onto the jets, so they brought the 707 out to Australia, and we're endorsing, I got endorsed on it down at Avalon, just out of Geelong in Victoria, and thereafter I stayed in the flight training sections for the rest of my time with Qantas, endorsing people on 707, 148, 338s, and then eventually the jumbos, and I finished my time on the jumbos. During that period, of course, we did a lot of time in the simulators, redathons, and eventually the 707, 747 simulators, which were excellent for training pilots. Yeah. And that's just a short and quick resume of what I did with Qantas.
What was it like converting over to the 707s from the Connies?
Qantas training, without hesitation, was the best in the world, and we maintained that rate of proficiency right throughout. You could find chaps that were never going to do much good at it, and they were given a very fair go, about 2 or 3 goes, and they were then relegated to be first officers. But we had some pilots who had flown nothing but DC-3s, brought them down, and they converted to the 707.
Wow.
They converted, which was quite a feat, I think, from DC-3 to a 707.
Certainly. Yeah.
The training facilities at Avalon in Victoria were excellent. We had a long strip, tower control, and an ILS, and it was a beaut spot to train people, and the training really paid off with Qantas in the long run, which was very, very good, because on their operation on the line they were so proficient that the cost of operating, very, very few diversions. The only diversions were on account of shocking weather from when an airport was closed. But apart from that, and when I left Qantas, we were bringing them in this jumbo 00 with auto land. The first thing you'd see is the green lights of the threshold of the runway. The aeroplane would flare with auto land, touchdown, and all you had to do was guide it. Eventually we had auto braking, which brought the aeroplane to a successful and safe halt. Yeah. And thereafter, the only hard part was finding the taxiways in fog. But a follow me Jeep would usually come out and bring you in at some of the international airports, which was very, very good. When the Boeing pilots come out, Ed Hartz was my instructor, Russ Bohm was another Boeing instructor, and Russ Bohm, for one reason or another, was on a flight with me one day out over Bass Strait. And he said, these things will roll beautifully, you know, Len. And I said, oh, fair enough. I was in the left-hand seat, he was in the right-hand seat. He said, right, take her up to 13th hour, put her in a dive, get about 320 knots on the clock, and we'll send her round. I said, sure about this? There were no black boxes in these days. He said, yeah, so we did a roll, positive G on all the way around, and Tommy Mitchell was the flight engineer, and I turned around and I said to him, what do you think of that? He said, what do you think of what? I said, just went round. He said, round what? I said, round like that. He said, you're kidding. I said, oh no. But they do go round, and they're quite safe. As a matter of fact, Russ Bohm did the same thing over in Washington, out of Seattle, with some pilots on board, but he must have started too low because he didn't pull out, and they went in a ravine and killed himself, wiped the aeroplane off, and a lot of pilots. So the big thing is you've got to have air underneath you when you try any of these manoeuvres. But they don't do that anymore because you never get upsets, although some of the things I see on TV these days with the air accidents, it's on TV at the present moment. Some of these pilots get into shocking situations and they recover, most of them, from it. In the simulators, of course, you could give the pilot that you're instructing, you could convey to him all the different situations. One emergency, another emergency, that's a dual emergency, which is a thing you didn't like to do, but it was there to be done in the simulator. They weren't assessed on this, but it was shown to them, just in case. The same reason they have teats on a bull, just in case. You know? And the object of the simulator training was to train people, not fail them on anything. If they were lacking in some area, you would really bring them up to scratch. And if you said, all right, well, I won't fail you, but there's an area there that we could spend a little more time on, so I'll put you down for another period tomorrow and we'll really get into it, and when you do this you'll be as good as I am at solving these problems. Yeah. And you'll feel all the better and safer pilot for it.
So do you have any famous passengers on your years of flying, Len? Any that come to mind?
Had my wife.
Good answer.
Oh, I guess I've had various Qantas officials and people like that. I was never fortunate enough to fly royally around there. Not that they would have been any different to any other passenger. The object of the exercise, these people pay their money. The thing that, after a while, when you're flying the route for a long while with different categories of aircrew, first officer, second officer and pilots, bring them up to scratch, checking their proficiency and what have you. The one thing that I really tried to do and loved getting something out of was operating an aeroplane on schedule. If that aeroplane was due to leave Sydney at 8 o'clock in the morning, I'd like to see it depart at 8 o'clock. If it was due to arrive in Bangkok, say at 7 o'clock at night, I'd like to be there at 7 o'clock and operate 45-minute turnarounds. I'd love to see a 45-minute turnaround. And the Qantas training was that good, you could accomplish these timetables. And that's where I got a lot of satisfaction out of operating a big machine with up to 400 odd passengers on board, 14 crew, and all the ground staff, engineers, baggage, loaders, and what you will, operating that machinery right on schedule. That's where I got my pleasure from.
Yeah. What was it like converting over to the 747s for the first time from the 70s?
From the 707 338 to the jumbos, we went across to Seattle, and the Boeing pilots were very patient with us. When I got over there and I saw a jumbo come in, and some of these old grey-headed American pilots get out of this enormous machine and get down on the ground, I thought, well, if they can do it, I can do it. And they used to take us across the range there to King County and endorse us on the type. And they said we were quite proficient. And if they said it, I thought, well, with one's background experience, and having done all your time in the simulators before you went over there, the 747 simulator, you knew you could operate that aeroplane, and the big thing about it was you knew all the systems, and you knew the Pratt & Whitneys out there on the wings were very reliable. So much so that purely for demonstration purposes down at Avalon in a jumbo, I've taken off with pilots, captains, and said, I'll show you fellas something. At a safe height, or during takeoff, you would fail one engine when you had your speeds at which you proceeded and did not abort. 500 feet you could fail the second engine, so you got two on one side going for you, and took her up to circuit altitude. Now I said, I'm going to show you something about drag. I said, we'll pull the third one back, which they're all idling, they weren't completely shut down, of course. Now, I said, the big lesson here is to learn something about drag. You don't start hanging the acceptors like the undercarriage, an enormous undercarriage out, or start shoving the flaps out too early. You display a little bit of acumen and start hanging out these acceptors where they create a lot of drag. And I said, well, continue on in this one engine round on the final approach. I said, as we enter final approach and line her up, we'll now extend the gear. Down goes the gear, back comes the airspeed. You've got one engine going for you. Now I said, what's that threshold down there on the 1,000-foot marker? And keep this continuous glide slope and watch your speed decaying down to a safe speed plus an extra 15, 20 knots for mum and the kids, because you've only got one engine. And now start putting your flaps out. And that went off beautifully, and they said, Len, thank you, we've learned something today. I said, we'll never demonstrate that to anyone else, but you've learned something about drag. Always keep that in the back of your mind. Yeah. If you ever have an emergency, 2 engines would be the most, but just use your head a little bit regarding drag. Don't be too early in putting out the acceptors, but get them out at the right place because you need them for landing.
Yeah. Any funny stories with your time with the Royal Flying Doctors? Or any stories, I should say?
Well, went into Toowoomba one day with, let me see, 2 pregnant women that I had picked up and had to come down to Brisbane very, very quickly. I think I picked them up from Roma or some little place out there, I forget the name of it now. But I had to go into Toowoomba for something, and there were another 3 pregnant women there. So I put them on board, and at that time the Toowoomba airport, it's on a bit of a plateau, Toowoomba, as you know. It was all grass with a paddock, from what I can remember. But right across the far boundary in the direction I was going, the general direction of Brisbane, was a telephone line. I looked at that line, I looked at these people, these 5 pregnant women, and I thought, geez, a short strip, and I'm going to be very fortunate to make that. On takeoff, the thought did cross my mind, I'm not going to make it across the top of that telephone line. There's only one place to go, and that's under it. So I put the aeroplane down under the telephone wires, and then the thought struck me, oh, that DH-84 is sticking way up the rudder. My God, I hope it doesn't hit it, but I was fortunate it didn't hit it, and we made it quite successfully into Brisbane.
Had you tried to go over, it could have been a different story again.
But it hit the wires, anything could have happened there.
Yeah.
The Reverend Flynn, he was a passenger one day with the Dr. Vickers and myself out to Windora to meet some of the people out that way. The people out there were very, very appreciative of the pedal wireless, which was brought to light, or more or less invented by Alf Traeger down in Adelaide. Very well known in the radio industry, Alf Traeger. And all these people out there had this pedal wireless with which they could communicate with the Royal Flying Doctor base and one another, I believe. And the different stations out there, as far as the telephone was concerned, there were dual lines, and when one person was using the line, other people could listen to it, that sort of thing. But they were fantastic people out there in Western Queensland at that time. They'd do anything for you, and they'd bend over backwards. They would run functions for the Royal Flying Doctor Service. And lots of little things happened out there.
What were your memories of Dr. Bickers?
One of the greatest men I've ever met. The greatest, including my different people, and I loved him like a father. He looked after people out there. He worked for years without pay. He convinced the politicians in Canberra to match dollar for dollar grant to the Royal Flying Doctor Service. In other words, if people contributed $1, the federal government would contribute $1, which funded the Royal Flying Doctor Service. The saddest part of his life was when he was travelling across to Britain on a boat as the ship's doctor at Cape Town, I think it was. He suffered a oh, I'm not too sure of the exact medical term, but he had a hole in his heart and there was no one there to attend him. All the medical assistance he'd conveyed to others when he really needed himself, there was no one there to help him, and he perished, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But he was never ever recognised sufficiently, in my opinion, by the politicians or the governments. I remember him now. He's got two boys now, David and Robert Bickers, both doctors, both retired. They were with him out at Charleville when I was there, little fellows, and they both became doctors, followed their father's profession. Very nice fellows. I remember coming back from Thargomindah one day with Dr. Bickers on board. Dr. Bickers suffered from asthma, and I never knew this. And it was a beautiful evening. We get back there just about sunset in the DH-83, the Fox Moth, UZD, the one that I subsequently crashed up in New Guinea. Got over Charleville and I thought, oh, well, I was up at 3,000. I thought, good. There's only the doctor in the front. So I put it down in the dive and did a loop. He's in the front, put positive G on it. He didn't leave the seat, or his bag didn't leave the seat, and got on the ground and he's just about suffocating. His asthma didn't react too well to it. I said I could have killed him with that asthma. It was very unfortunate that I never did again after that. We used to slip in Karachi when we were on the 1049s, and we used to have several days there, of course. And bit off, once again, the first officer organised a bit of a soiree an evening, and he organised a tent from one of the local sheikhs. We put this tent up in the suitable area there in the premises, the Speedbird House. And I don't know what happened, him or Andy Young, something happened and the tent caught on fire. Unfortunately, the sheikh's tent caught on fire over there. And we didn't gain too many marks off the sheikh for setting fire to his tent at Speedbird House. We used to get haircuts over there for, I think it was 15 rupees, which was the equivalent of about a shilling or sixpence to get a good haircut there in Karachi. It was quite interesting there. And following that, we used to slip over at Bahrain off the 1049s, and all these places were notorious for getting tummy trouble, gut trouble, and I had, over in Bahrain, I had what I thought was mild cholera. You'd get this terrific pain, and then you would break out in sweat and vomit if you could, but you were pretty much exhausted and vomiting, and the whole exercise lasted 40 minutes. And that lasted about a day and a half. Shook it off. Thereafter we used to carry sulfathalazole, the white tablets. We used to swallow these things to keep the bugs out of our stomach where possible. There was one of our Qantas managers over there, he had it badly, Hartley Shannon I think it was. And the doctor put him on strawberries and Scotch whisky. I don't know what the strawberries did, but the Scotch whisky was the thing. If you drank it neat, it helped tremendously. It was only about 25 bob for half a gallon of Scotch whisky in those days. I remember I got back to Sydney, and the White Horse Scotch whisky people were promoting their brand of whisky at that time, and I rang them up and I said, listen, for what it's worth, I buy you a Scotch whisky with a little white horse that's attached in a string to the label. And I said, between Sydney and London, you will find little white horse emblems all the way across, because there's one thing about that white horse whisky, if you drank that neat, you never got tummy trouble. And they said, oh yes, and what about going into London? I said, oh yeah, the customs were pretty severe in those days. You couldn't bring spirits into London. So I said, what we used to do, we'd buy a flat plastic flask which held a bottle and a half of your whisky, and we'd put it in the flask, and we'd put a couple of green dye tablets in with it, and we'd go into London, and the customer would say, what's this? I said, oh, that's some muck we bought in Singapore, it's Doesn't hurt you, of course, and that's it. Take it through. One occasion, I had half a bottle of White Horse whisky, and my name is McNeil, and the Scottish Customs officer was Mac someone, and I said, listen, old son, we're in the same tribe. He said, I got to confiscate. I said, how about if I pour it out? He said, if you pour it out, that will satisfy me. So I disconnected the little connecting tube under the wash basin, held the bottle down there, or a large container, and he watched me pour it down the sink. He said, you have disposed of the whisky. He didn't see, or didn't want to see what was underneath the sink. He said, oh, away you go. I said, yes. I said, remember Culloden? He said, yes, I remember Culloden. He said, away you go, no charge. You better turn that off at the minute. There are lots of little things like that.
Yeah.
Going into Karachi, of course, we'd sometimes have trouble with the custom people there. If you didn't grease them, they'd jump on you. One thing we did, we had used to buy loaves of bread, hollow it out, put a bottle of scotch in there and put the top back on, the crust back on, and get a few bottles in that way. And you had to, because you had 2 or 3 days in Karachi, and you would get gut trouble unless you took precautions along those lines.
It certainly worked, eh?
I think so.
Yep.
It doesn't happen anymore, of course.
Of course, flying in New Guinea is very different to a lot of other areas.
Oh yes, you kept out of cloud as much as you possibly could. I remember one day I went into Wow, and I was coming out through the Black Cat, but it was shocking weather, and you'd keep out of cloud if you could, because the instruments weren't all that good in the DH-84s, and I can remember being over Lake Trist one day. That's a lake up there in the hills, and I needed altitude badly, and I thought I couldn't go anywhere because of the cloud, and I thought I'll fly around till I run out of gas, but in the process of flying round and round, the weight decreased, and I managed to get altitude. Altitude is what I needed, and eventually got sufficient altitude to clear the hills out there, and I put her on the gauges, that's the instruments. Only lasted about 8 minutes and come out over the Huon Gulf. Johnny Rose, who was a pilot with Mandated Airlines at the time, he was going down to Popondetta, I think it was, where Bert Kindle had a rubber plantation. I'd never been there, and I was looking forward to picking up some freight from Bert Kindle. And I said, any chance of coming along? I want to have a look at that place before I go. And he said, sure, hop in, I'm going down empty. So hopped in. And we no sooner taken off from Lay than the engine cut. You know, I said, oh, this will test you, John, we'll have to go back. He said, no trouble, we'll go back in one, the second engine cut. I said, oh, geez, what happens now? He said, we're going in. I said, make it as far as you can. So he made it to the Tenyo Maru, and you'll see this in that write-up I've given you there, and put it down in the water. When it hit the water, my seatbelt let go, broke, it was old material, and I went up, my head went through the roof, the fabric and wood. I saw the outline of the hills, and I thought, oh, I'm going to live, I've made it. So I climbed out on the roof, and there was an engineer on board. He came out with me. I said, where's John? He said, oh, he's sitting in the cockpit. I shook him, and I said, come on, John, hop out, you'll drown if you stay in there. Anyhow, he hopped out, and we were standing on the top of this DH-84, which was slowly sinking. He said, just a minute, my camera's there. So he dived back and got his camera. We were all back on the roof, and there was a coon going by and a lacquer toy, so we called him over. He said, listen, old son, you keep an eye on this, we'll borrow your lacquer toy and we'll go into shore. So he stayed there, we went into shore. And I had this ring round my neck where my head had jerked forward when I went through the roof there, and I'm laying down on my bunk, and a Jeep pulled up outside, and they said, come on, we want to have a look at you up in the hospital. So I went up to the hospital, and Dr. Scraggs was the medico there, and he grabbed me and started tearing my head around. For the first time in my life, I passed out. And apparently they gave me a shot of morphine. And the effects of morphine, I woke up, I thought I was in this beautiful sunny garden. It was the effects of morphine.
Yeah.
And I can now understand why people hook themselves on this, if that's what it does to them. But thereafter I was okay.
Yeah.
Went back to flying again in a day or two. And they pulled the DH-84 out. They tied a rope on it and a tractor and pulled it out from there, and they wanted to find out why the two engines failed. And they examined the fuel filters. And they tasted it was fresh water in the fuel filters. That caused the failure. So, which is a good lesson. Always check your fuel filters before you take off, which we always did anyhow without training, but apparently they didn't do it in the mandated airlines at that time. I used to cut all the chaps' hair up there. I bought myself a pair of clippers. And I didn't know much about hair cutting, but after you cut a few heads, they used to front up and I'd give them haircuts and one thing and another. What they saved in hairdressing fees, and there were very few hairdressers up there, of course. There you go, and turn it into beer up in the bar and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I was flying a DH-83, that's the Fox Moth again. And I got out of a DH-84 and Pat Murdoch, the girl in the office there, said, "Oh Len, we've got a chap here who wants to go across to Finchhaven," she told me. I said, "All right, I'll give him across there." Put him in the front of the 83, which was a little cabin. And halfway across to Finchhaven, this bloke was stark raving mad. He's throwing notepacks with a little hole back to me. I looked at him, "I'm back out of Bilala." So I landed back in Lay. Pat Murdoch came out and she knew immediately what had happened. She said, "I realise what it is." I said, "All right, don't say anything, I'll take him up to Bilala," which I did.
Do you have any interesting sort of landings in bad condition in the jets?
In the jets?
Yeah.
No, our training catered for all the bad weather that we were given. Never worried about it to come in heavy rain, and you'd know from the training that you were given that the landing was going to be successful, although it was unfortunate in heavy rain or bad winds. Down at Avalon, I discovered down there that you could land a jet. I think it was the Jumbo, I'm not too sure now, it might have been the 707 with full rudder, while you still had a little bit of aileron control, and the maximum up there I think was 52 knots. That was the absolute limit, but you're not permitted to land with the crosswind to that amount. But I think you've got a limit of X number of knots, might be 30 knots or something like that. Over that you can't land. I forget, they've probably changed the regulations now, I don't know. But apart from that, going into Schiphol in Amsterdam in fog, it was very, very good, and you knew that you were going to break out at the advertised site, and those Dutchmen, they were good, and you'd break out, and there was the white lines coming at you one after another.
What are your memories of Bill Edwards?
Bill Edwards, a gentleman, one of nature's gentlemen. I made an error with Bill, who was giving me a route check on the 1049 before I was released. When you're coming down through certain altitudes, I think it was above 10,000 feet, you're on standard, which is 1013 millibars, and as you come down you're supposed to reset your altitude on your altimeter to the QNH on the airport. And I had overlooked it. And I'd done everything perfect till then. And as we were coming in, he said to me, "How about your QNH?" And I thought, "Oh my God, I'll let the side down. I never ever missed it again." But he just told me, and he didn't mention it in the report, which he's quite entitled to do if he wanted to, but he knew that I'd made an error and had admitted it. Another time coming back from Avalon into Sydney in a 707, Eric Robinson was in chief of the training section. He was sitting in the right-hand seat, I was in the left-hand seat. And when you're coming into Sydney, in those days in the 707, you had to, I think it was, you had to place your pitot heaters, two of them, from on to off. And I realised that he was watching me, waiting for me to make one error, and I wasn't going to make one. And I thought, oh my God, I've forgotten to turn those speedo heaters off. And he's going to pick it up. Is that something out there on the right-hand wing? I tell you, I got those two heaters off. Quick smart. And I don't know whether he ever knew or not. Oh dear.
Reg Darwell?
Reg, good man. He was the first officer when I knew Reg, yes. Reg, and he had a mate, I think they were halves in a light aircraft, which they subsequently sold. I used to strike all these chaps down at Geelong, of course, when we were based there doing licence renewals and training and one thing and another. Reg, I don't think he was christened Reg, but his initials were R-E-G, so he was always called Reg.
And you flew with Howard Morris a couple of times, Howard told me yesterday.
Howard would have been a first officer, I think.
Yeah.
He may have been a captain, I can't recall, and I don't think I mentioned names in my logbook when I was flying down there. It was just, but Howard was a great bloke, yes, he did his job perfectly as far as I was concerned. And that's what they paid us to do. They trained us, spent a lot of money training us, and they wanted to get the results which we gave them.